Welcome, Dr. Azza Karam. It's so wonderful to have you on my podcast channel, which is called The Mindful Conversationalist. And I'm so happy to see you again. It's been a long time and it's wonderful to have you here. I'm not going to introduce you because I want people to get to know you as we talk about your life's journey. And I want to start off by at the very beginning, right? Because I read that you grew up in Egypt and India, which I never knew before. And I wanted for you to share a little bit about your life being in Egypt and India, because I read that you were in a conservative Egyptian Muslim family and you had a Hindu nanny. And by just observing the different rituals and prayers, that's what sparked your interest in religion and religious collaboration. So maybe tell us about the time growing up in Egypt and India.
So that version that you just read out, Marilyn, is part of the growing up period. I actually grew up, I lived in many countries, different cultures. So India was one of them. Egypt is certainly where I was born, but I also lived in Romania and in Italy as a child. And so all of these different cultures and experiences influenced the way that I see the world. And I didn't see the world as monolithic because I was in such different places. And in each of these places, whether it was Egypt or India or, Romania or England or Italy, these are such hybrid cultures. There's so much diversity in them. So I grew up with diversity as the normal. And it was very difficult to then try to fit into a more homogeneous where everybody comes from the same place and everybody speaks and everybody looks alike. That's always been my challenge. And that's one of the reasons why I chose to live in the United States, because it's multicultural, it's diverse. Diversity defines it. Diversity is where I am comfortable. When people are either all look alike or similar or speak alike or think alike, I usually stand out like a sore thumb. I'm much more comfortable where people are very, very different. That means also different opinions, different perspectives, attitudes, ways of thinking, ways of doing. So that's been very important for me, both in growing up, getting conditioned to diversity and difference, and then making my own choices to be in spaces where diversity and difference is the norm.
And in this period while you were moving between countries, were you ever exposed to any extreme religious conditions in a positive way and in a negative way? Did you have any encounters during that time you grew up?
I think because my family was devout, I wouldn't say extreme, but I would say I was very used to religious observances. I was very used to my ayah, the lady who looked after me, sometimes taking me with her to the temple if she was allowed to. I was used to seeing her doing her puja. I was used to hearing the church bells ring. I was used to hearing the call to prayers. I was used to religion. And I think most of us who live in the so-called developed world are like that. We are used to the religious being visible, being part of our everyday lives, which is why when I then wanted to do more work on issues of, international development, human rights, humanitarian work, peace and security, for me, these are not separate from religious aspects. These are religious as part and parcel of our everyday. I grew up in a context where we say, inshallah, alhamdulillah, all the time. It doesn't matter what language we're speaking. It's just part of our dictionary, our ordinary lexicon. And we don't even think about it. Like, I have to remember to say, inshallah, or, God willing, or alhamdulillah, thank God. I have to remember to say this. I have to remember. I never had that. It was a absolutely spontaneous way of being that one would always think in terms of the godly, even in the everyday language of simple things, right? And it didn't occur to me that this might be strange or different until decades later, when I was in one of my many jobs. I was interviewing for a job, and the boss of that organization then said, "Well, you will hear from us then on I don't know what day." And I said, "Okay, inshallah." And he looks at me and he says, "No, you will hear from us." And I looked back at him and I said, "Inshallah." Right? And so it was that one moment where, wait, I didn't even realize I had said inshallah. I just think, God willing, inshallah, all the time. Something that's going to happen in the future, tomorrow, in an hour, inshallah, right? God willing. And it's not because you are afraid that it won't happen, but it's more because you're calling upon spirit to be with you in those things due to happen, right? So the spirit is with you all the time. I don't even think about it. And then here I am speaking to a very Western gentleman who's like, "Why would you want to bring this into this? I mean, we're going to call you. You're coming." Anyway, and that was when I noticed, the different worldviews that are there. And I suddenly realized how I must appear to others as somebody who's perhaps so religious, when in fact I am not so religious. I'm a person of faith for sure, but as you can see, I'm kind of pretty much an ordinary person. So, but I appear as such because of the fact that religious discourse and ways of thinking are just part of who I am and how I think. And it was a helpful indicator, because then I could understand how some people in very Western contexts can sometimes feel that's way too religious. Just even saying those words is just, it's odd. And you begin to understand, you see yourself and from the prism of others, but you also see how others behave and think very differently vis-a-vis religious issues, and largely, frankly, only Western, Europeans and some Americans actually, and Canadians, not all. Because I think the understanding of how religion is such an integral part of everyday life is actually more pervasive in North America than it is in Europe. In Europe, there's still the need to sort of keep distant, keep separate. They are not one and the same, so to speak. These are different realms. Whereas in the rest of the world, we've never had to consider different realms of existence. But being a person of faith has always been part of who we are and how our cultures are. And we celebrate our respective religious holidays. We celebrate them together. The more diverse we are, the more we're going to be doing that. That's why I love diversity and differences, because it makes it's more enriching somehow.
Yeah, that's true. Hey, it's really two different kind of worlds. So, listening about your journey now from all the countries that you've traveled, and you ended up in America, right? And understanding that you love diversity. I want to just uncover a little bit what happened along the way. So I know that you were involved with the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. There was the OECD, the EU, and you also taught and lectured in various academic institutions in Europe, North America, including in the Arab region and the United States military. So maybe you can share with us this time of your life. What was it like, and what was the experience for you that shaped how you became an individual?
Sure. And just as a correction, I didn't serve in the United States military, but there is a college, if you will, a university for cadets that's called West Point. It's West Point Military Academy, and I have lectured there quite a bit early on. But I didn't serve in any military context anywhere. But to your question, I think my very first experience in professionalism and being at work, working beyond the study, that I did was within the human rights space. So that's the first. If one was to be breastfed in a work context, the milk I had was human rights, and that's how I learned to understand and appreciate and see the world around me in the context of, you're human, you have human rights, and to also begin to see that we are not necessarily comfortable with equal human rights for all at all times, that even those of us who advocate for human rights, who fight for human rights, sometimes are more comfortable with certain human rights for certain people at certain moments in time. And it was interesting because for me, the human rights understanding or worldview coincides perfectly with the religious inclination, because the creator, in my understanding, the creator created us different, but didn't create us in ways that we would be less than one another. If we are more fortunate in some things, it's because we have an obligation to look after those who are less fortunate than us. So this level playing field of being created to look after one another, because we're all creatures and beings of the divine, this understanding to me is a perfectly religious understanding. It's not an alien secular concept. And that's essentially what human rights are, is we're all created equal. We have equal rights. We need to make sure that not only we respect them, not only that we live them and grant them, but that we actually support one another to achieve the equality of our human rights. So for me, those two concepts were perfectly understandable, the religious and the so-called secular human rights concept. And it was only later, when I started working in very secular settings or in very religious settings, I was always working with religious communities and organizations, but working from within secular entities. It was only when I got deeper into those spaces that I realized, wait, why are you not seeing, I'm asking the religious spaces, why are you not seeing human rights as a perfectly working aspect of your faith? Why do some of you say we don't need it? We've got our religion, our holy books, our whatever. We don't need human rights. I'm like, well, why would you even think that? When they complement each other brilliantly, we wouldn't have had human rights if we didn't have our faith, our respective faiths. And one is a tool that can help in different spaces. The other is what we are obviously spiritually inclined towards, but one is the legal thing that helps define our laws, so that not each of us has separate laws for their respective spiritual tradition, but we're all equal and equally judged legally. And then I would pose the same question to the very secular folks who would be like, what do you need religion for? I mean, that's just divisive and it's confusing. I'd be like, but why don't you understand that ability to have a faith and believe and serve with that mindset is quintessentially what is required for us to realize our respective human rights together. One informs the other. Your faith, you're a person of faith, it informs your inclination towards human rights. If you are inclined towards human rights, you understand the inclinations towards being towards the sacred, because these are complementary. In my mind, that's always been an aspect of complementarity. They've never been separate realms, whereas in fact, they are considered separate realms. And the irony was to see how within the religious realms, the argument against human rights could sometimes be more powerfully made, which I had not expected. And I had to learn to appreciate why there was this way of thinking. And I think that's always been one of my most, the biggest aspects I learned from over the years in my own life and in my own career, to understand why we tend to segment what we believe in and how we believe, whether it is religious or not. But this tendency to segment, which is quintessentially a Western Enlightenment thinking, where you put things in boxes and categories, and then you work with them in their respective categories if you work with them at all. Whereas in my culture and in my own traditional learning, even though I lived in so many different countries, I see the synergy, I see the synchronicity, I see the things going together as opposed to being compartmentalized. And when I see what's going on around us now, I always think we've compartmentalized so much that we no longer can see the thread of the shared common humanity. We have to make a case for it. We have to argue for it. We have to write books about it. We have to theorize it, because we've broken things up into their respective elements. We struggle. We have different struggles, even though they are for the same things. But this is called the human rights struggle. This is called the women's rights struggle. This is called an LGBT struggle. This is called an I don't know a democracy struggle. This is called a what? And this is called a public health struggle. And you're thinking, guys, it applies to the one person and the whole of the community. So why are we dividing and siloing our efforts so much? And I think that's part of what we're all in a bit struggling with now, is that we've lost the common thread of our humanity, and we're so busy fighting, struggling to achieve very noble things, but often in isolation from one another and from each other. The issues themselves are in isolation from each other. And I thought that COVID was a great moment, Marilyn. As traumatic and terrible as it was actually an opportunity for us to see how intimately interconnected we are as human beings, and our issues, our needs are, our aspirations are. We can't believe that we will be safe within certain boundaries that we've created that are totally artificial. We should not believe that we're going to be safe if we keep ourselves walled in. And I thought COVID was going to give us that lesson, make it super duper clear, because here's a virus that doesn't make any distinction, that doesn't stop at the borders of any one country or group or nation or ethnicity or race or religion, etc. It affects everybody dramatically. And yet it seems that what has happened is, instead of us collectively as humanity learning that lesson of our interdependence, that for many, we became even more isolated and insulated and insisting on our individual well-being rather than on our collective well-being. That probably took us a lot different from your question, but it is.
Okay, but it's sort of showing, like, I understand what you're saying. We've segregated and separate. We made things so separate from each other in the way our journey unfolds in life. And I also had that thought. We've complicated things so much, because I discovered that lesson when I was working with the United Nations GEO7 process. And I was like, okay, we're working towards climate change, but why do we need a 5-year documentation to actually make an action or a task? And why have we complicated life so much? There's so many levels of structures and things that need to happen. But it's so simple, the solutions can be so simple. But it's like we've just added layers upon our life. And that was just like a lesson that I learned from the whole thing about humanity and how it's structured and how it has put so much processes to complicate life. And just like going a little bit more into your journey before we branch off into a conversation more about religion. I want to know, because you spent a lot of time, 2 decades of your life with the United Nations. And what was that period of your life like, working with United Nations? And because you were involved in a lot of things, including the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism. There was the Multi-Faith Advisory Council on the task force. There was a lot of things that I read up on the internet, right, that said you were involved in a lot of aspects. So maybe you can just share a little bit of that time there and the interfaith and multi-religious work that you worked on.
Sure. First of all, I would say there's been a common trend in my life, which is where I don't stay in one place for longer than 3 or 4 years. I try to learn as much as I can. I try to serve as much as I can, but then I also want new challenges, and that's how I feel like I learn. Many of my friends and family would always be like, "Good grief, can you not just settle in one place and just be, happy with where you're at?" And this constant moving, moving, moving. And I realized that also that certainly from certain perspectives, I tend to be moving around quite a bit. But that's how I've learned. I move around physically, not just in terms of office and so on or institution, but I move around. And in the house that I live in now, my husband always complains that I'm moving things around the whole time. It's like something that's changing all the time, and it is true. It is part of my character. It is part of who I am, and so therefore, even though I stayed in the UN for 20 years nearly, I never stayed in one place or did one thing. I kept shifting my portfolio. So when I was in UNDP, I did multiple initiatives. The Arab Human Development Report was one of them, but work on gender and on math and science education and youth and development. I made sure that I could serve multiple portfolios so that I was constantly not only meeting new constituencies and trying to serve and learn, but also that I was challenged, because every domain of engagement, of service, has its own challenges. I moved from UNDP to UNFPA, and UNFPA I moved 3 or 4 times, different places and divisions. The one thing that I think stayed constant is my passion for all things religion. And I remember when I first went into UNDP, I was told, we don't do religion. We don't do that. And so it feels like a great blessing that by the time I left the UN system 20 years later to join Religions for Peace, I had contributed to establishing an interagency task force on religion, a multi-faith advisory council on religion, entities within the system that continue to function till today, long after I left. And for me, that is knowing that this was made possible, obviously by the grace of the Almighty, and thanks to being able to work across a very complicated, big system called the United Nations system. People tend to think it's the United Nations. It is a universe of planets called the United Nations. Over 60 different entities is the United Nations system. So being able to learn about this and navigate so many different entities under the rubric of the United Nations was a constant challenge, but it's also been one of the things that I feel I have benefited most professionally, because I was able to see and work with people from so many different parts of the world. And that's the strength of the UN system, is that coming together from across all sorts of differences. And remember, I told you that's where I'm most comfortable. The more monolithic or homogeneous an environment, the less I feel at home. The more diverse and hybrid, the more I'm at home. So I was very much at home in the UN system, but I did feel that we had to bring in this aspect of why religions matter. And because we don't do religions, I was like, what do you mean you don't do religions? You do everything that is and has to do with religion. How can you tell me that you're going to serve communities, work with governments to improve their democratic accountability, legislation, laws, serve their public health needs, improve their nutrition aspects, and all of that's not going to have to do with religion, when the basic servants of communities in these nations are religious organizations and communities? Like the original ministries of health and finance and education are religious. They were the religious institutions long before we had governments, and that you still see that in Religions for Peace's website. Long before we had governments, we had religious institutions and religions, and that's just a fact. So I would always go back to my secular development counterparts in the UN system and say, what do you think you're doing? You're ignoring the expertise, the history, the wisdom, and the infrastructure, actual physical infrastructure of institutions that serve the things you're supposed to be improving, that serve and were the original governments and governmental infrastructure serving communities. So you cannot do that. You cannot improve public health without working with the faith-based health service providers, who are in some cases 40%, providing 40% of basic healthcare in the same countries that you're supposed to be improving the health system with the government of. You can't improve education without working with those providing education to communities deprived and very well off, thank you very much, religious institutions. So, and I would always use my example. I say, look, I'm a Muslim. I went to a formerly Catholic school. So I don't understand where you guys think you're going to improve systems of social services for nations when you're not working with the communities that were the original and are still there and will be there long before and long after governments themselves fail to deliver, right? So that was the argument that I always made in the system. And eventually, we were able to work with my colleagues in the World Bank to produce the kinds of reporting that would make the case and provide the evidence. We're working with other faith-based organizations to provide evidence that indeed there is a very legitimate argument to be made for why religions are not just about I don't mean it nastily, but it's not only the spiritual. It is the very, very practical infrastructure in all communities around the world. Even in the United States, which is supposed to be very secular, but even in the United States, we know there was a statistic in 2012, I believe, even though I was trying to retrieve it the other day and I couldn't, but it was something to the effect of over 50% of hospitals in the United States, public health system, are actually run by or through the Catholic Church. So you realize, wait, you're talking about public health infrastructure, not Catholic infrastructure, public health infrastructure that is run by, through, or in some ways administered via the Catholic Church. We haven't taken into account all the other churches and the other religions, communities who are providing also. So you begin to realize that there is such an interdependence of the work of sustainable development, peace and security. How are you going to resolve conflict if you're not involving the faith community leaders and members who are at war with one another, who may be fueling the rhetoric of war, who may be very closely aligned with the governments at war with one another? How do you ignore that aspect of human existence, of human life, of public service, of infrastructure provision, and things that influence the mindsets and attitudes and behaviors of common human beings? How do you ignore all that because you're trying to work within a secular framework that says religion doesn't really exist and we don't do it? So that was my struggle, if you will, within the UN. But by the time I left, God willing, it was possible to be able to say, look, we've changed that way of thinking in the system. We've made the case for why religions matter, how they matter, who these religious communities are. And it was in that process, Marilyn, that I realized that some of the strongest resistance to human rights was coming from some of the religious sectors, and specifically from religious leaders. And you cannot do development, peace and security, anything without human rights. Human rights is a foundation because, again, it's that vision that you and I share in a common existence, and we are equally valuable and important. And that premise of human rights is absolutely essential for wanting to do education, nutrition, sanitation, health, peace, whatever it is. You need that. You need that precept that we are equals, and we must ensure that we are equally able to access the resources available, that we can give each other and secure equal opportunities for one another and for generations to come. That human rights understanding for me is foundational to all this work. So then to see the resistance from certain religious leaders saying, we don't need this. We have our belief system. We don't need human rights. And it is, for me, we don't do religion is about as catastrophic as we don't need human rights. Those two ways of negating the necessary coexistence model mindset, they are equally problematic. And so I realized that I could continue to stay in the UN and try to work in this space, but I needed to serve the religious leaders themselves so that I could, on the one hand, learn why and when and how they made those arguments and believed in them, that we don't need human rights. Or, by the way, used human rights, certain human rights arguments, to make the case against other human rights. Religious institutions and religious leaders, some of them can be very good at that. Yes, we're all for human rights. But this and this and this right are very, very important for us. For your work on freedom of religion and belief, that is one of the rights that's like, no, of course, absolutely. Human rights, freedom of religion and belief, very fundamental human right, absolutely needed. Okay, but it's not going to be realized in isolation from the other rights. And the other rights, some of them are really problematic for some religious leaders and institutions. So how are you going to cope with that? How are you going to balance that out? So no, we're going to do freedom of religion and belief. Or no, we're doing children's rights and care for children. Or no, we're doing environment. We're working on the environment. Those are the primary rights that we need to focus on. And there's a problem with that. There's a problem with that because there's no way that you're going to segment specific rights and think that by working on them and defending them alone, you're going to be able to achieve what ultimately and per definition requires all rights together at the same time. And so that was why I left the UN, and I said, okay, I had an opportunity within religious peace, which I'd worked in before for 4 years when I first came to the United States. Said, let me, since this is the key space, the religious leaders is such a critical space for decision making, which in turn means a critical forum for behavioral and change in attitudes. Let me see how to serve those communities and learn from that space, but how I can better be a servant to that religious leadership cadre. Because I was working with faith-based NGOs. I had a network of over 700 faith-based organizations around the world. But working with NGOs is not the same as working with religious institutions. And when you work with religious leaders, you actually work with religious institutions. And so it was important for me to take on that challenge, if you will. How do I serve and learn more as I'm challenged? How do I learn more about religious leaders and religious institutions? I was in the UN for many years. Before that, within another intergovernmental setting, I understood the ways governments think. So this was an opportunity for me to try to learn how religious institutions think. And that determined the decision for me to join Religions for Peace. And that was, for me, if you will, the religious institutions and religious leaders, that was the last part of the journey of working with the religious infrastructures of the world. So it was important for me to pass that milestone, if you will, of service to that space and learning from that space. And right, again, 4 years later, it's like, great, time to now see where else the service and the challenges need to be confronted and honored. And that's how I did a stint. I was asked by a former UN boss of mine, whom I have tremendous respect and regard for. I was asked by her to come and help do something for the organization that she sat on the board of. And I did. As soon as I left Religions for Peace, I served with them, with that other organization, which was a women's rights organization. And I felt I needed to honor her ask. She was somebody who matters a great deal to me. And I did. And I'm grateful I had that opportunity. And it helped me also reconnect with the women's and human rights realms, which I hadn't left, but I had got a little bit distant from as I tried to immerse myself in the religious realms. And so it was good to revisit. It was like paying a visit to part of the world where I grew up in, that is home, and realizing how things have changed or not, and realizing that the world of human rights itself has a lot of work that needs to be done within it. And that bridge between human rights and religious realms is still a very rickety bridge that's actually fallen apart and needs to be buttressed more. And that's how I arrived at Lead Integrity, because it was an idea to say, look, let's bring together those who have a holistic understanding and commitment to human rights, not one or two or three rights, not some rights, but not others, but those who are committed to the whole of the human rights agenda with a faith perspective. Professionals who are faith inspired, their faith inspires them hugely. They're not representing their religious institutions or their communities necessarily. They are faith inspired professionals who are committed to the whole of the human rights agenda. And that's what Lead Integrity brings together. So all of our team are professionals who come from different faiths, are inspired from by different faiths, from indigenous to Wiccan to you name it. We're not representing. I'm not a representative of the Muslim faith. None of them are representative of their respective, who are deeply inspired by our faiths. We're professionals in so many different arenas of life, from rocket science to elementary education and curricula. The one thing we hold dear is that faiths and human rights are intimately connected, and that you cannot realize one human right or some human rights at the expense of the others. And you will not be able to live in peaceful coexistence multi-religiously or spiritually unless and until we have honored the obligation to serve one another's human rights. That's the belief system of Lead Integrity. And the mission is to make ourselves available rather than do more projects and programs and things on our own and set up this and initiatives. There's so much being done already, but to make our wisdom available to those who may need that kind of wisdom on the specific issues, human rights, peace and security, sustainable development, humanitarianism, science, who would appreciate a faith-inspired perspective, faith-inspired legacy of service, professional service. So the youngest amongst us has about 20 years, but we're also setting up a youth cohort, the ones who are still in high school, in university, who are very curious about and inspired by their respective faith, by faith aspects, issues of faith, but they also are looking for careers in different arenas of life. So we're welcoming those communities too, of a certain age group, so that we don't get too complacent about our own wisdom of many years, but we are actually challenged by the younger ones who are amazing and brilliant. Mashallah, praise God. So that's how I arrived at the process of being in this space and understanding that we won't be able to serve one another and this world in isolated silos, but we have to work together, and it cannot be just religious or just secular. It cannot be just development or just human rights or just peace and security. It's got to be the whole of the human rights and responsibilities and dignity framework.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, by just listening to you and listening to your life's journey, you can see how the whole thing is interconnected, right? But as you said, we segregate everything. So that's like an amazing perspective. It's just given me a new understanding of how the system works. One that I've like never really completely understood in detail. But also, I think it's amazing that you led to a place of Lead Integrity that is using a faith-inspired way of helping society. So, can you maybe give an example, like of what it would look like in a if somebody contacted you, or in a practical way of how it operates?
Sure. I mean, I think easier to speak about myself than to speak about my colleagues. They are perfectly competent to speak about themselves. But I'll give you a wee example from my own service in this space is I often get contacted to help structure an approach or a program in a particular organization, or to help provide the training methodology for something that they have already arrived at. Some of it related to religion and religious leaders or institutions, some of it completely not related, but they want that, what would a faith-inspired expertise bring into a training that brings people onto the same understanding and level of knowing, for instance, this convention or this set of strategic objectives and priorities. So I will get approached to come and either speak to some of those issues and or to train on those. I get contacted by colleagues in different echelons of management, CEOs, who are at that stage where they need a counterpart who they can talk things out with in terms of what they're confronting on a very confidential level, what they're facing, what they're seeing in their own respective organizations, but appreciate the nuance that comes with being inspired by faith. That so they do want to talk about, God and belief and conviction and values. They want to talk about those things. They want to discuss that as part of what they're facing. So can we have the conversation? Can you walk with me? Can you accompany me in that journey of thinking together and so on? And I almost wish I had that myself when I was in the UN and other places, that I could have had that opportunity to have somebody to engage with as a mentor, coach, friend, listening partner who has that sensitivity about faith. You don't have to keep explaining, well, here's why faith matters, but you have it in your heart and you appreciate that someone else also can understand. And so that when you say certain things, you don't have to explain them, because it comes from that space of spiritual belief, and it's part of who you are, and it's part of what you're facing, and the way you're trying to work things out and negotiate your position or your situation with others in your own organization. And you just need that wisdom and the thinking counterpart, somebody you can think with. So I get that a lot. And I find it extremely helpful, because it's a totally different approach from sitting down and putting together projects and events and getting things, organizing teams to get things done. This is about, in a sense, whether it's the trainings or the coaching and mentoring, or whether it's even just talking with people about helping unpack certain things. It's an opportunity to learn about oneself as one serves others. And I appreciate that I get to this at this moment in my life, that I have an opportunity to serve others, while at the same time being able to use language of faith that is so comfortable for me. And at the same time, learn, because when you and I discuss something that matters very much to us, we learn a lot about ourselves as we learn about one another, and as we try to support one another. So that kind of coaching has been very helpful, I think, for me, and it's something I'm very much enjoying being able to do, but also being able to understand that I'm not beholden to any particular constituency. It's not governments that I have to serve or honor, a government, many governments. It's not a community of organizations. It's not a group of institutions, but it becomes more, who I'm serving becomes more, in a way, a more direct relationship that gives me the freedom also to say certain things that I wouldn't be able to say if I was supposed to be very careful of what you say to a government, or to many governments, or to a religious institution, or to a human rights organization. Usually one is constrained by what one stands for and how much one can say and how far one can go. And I have to say I'm enjoying the opportunity to just speak honestly and candidly to different people from different walks of life, and be able to point out certain things that would have been in my other lives, in my other institutional affiliations, would have been like, oh, you don't say that. Try to, sidestep that. Don't say it like that. You're familiar with those instances and situations yourself, Marilyn. You come across, especially women professionals, come across them a lot because we tend to self-censor tremendously, even more than what we need to do. As women professionals, we tend to take on our shoulders the burden of being even more careful, even more diligent, even more I don't know what. So not to have that burden anymore and be able to be asked to be candid, to be asked to be honest, is a new thing for me. No, are you sure I can be as provocative as I should be? I think, but realizing that as I near my 60s, it's kind of the right time to be able to speak honestly without feeling bound by institutional modes and whatever, but also being able to learn so much more about in that direct interaction with so many different people that I don't have to wear the hat of anything. It is simply the hat of being a professional in the realms out there. And yes, I'm faith inspired, and it's okay. I'm not representing any particular religion, because one of the things I remember getting quite a bit in Religions for Peace was, well, I know not exactly the right image of Muslim women and all that stuff. And I realized that I had to bear that too. I had to carry that responsibility. I am a Muslim, but I don't want to be, I don't feel I am in the right place to constantly be representing it when there are so many different understandings of what it is to be a professional. So now I'm a professional. I'm inspired by my faith. I'm not obligated to any one institution or anyone representing a particular image or visage or understanding. I'm a professional, and you're coming to me. You need my wisdom. So yes, happy to provide it the way I think it should be provided. And you know what? If it works out that there's something that I say that is so scary, somehow the fact that I am not formally representing any institution will make you a little bit more willing to hear it and to listen to it and to argue with it and to argue against it, because it's okay. We are not having to be bound by a particular ethos beyond that of professionalism and commitment to serve one another in this world. So yeah, it's exciting. It's interesting. It has its own challenges because, you're not being bound by an institution is also a sort of protection. It's a framework. It's a place you stand on. Whereas not to be bound by any one institution and to be creating who you are and how you are all the time means that you're never really on one level ground. You are just hovering above and different grounds. And it can be quite terrifying in the beginning. It's like, whoa, who do I belong to? Who am I speaking for? And eventually it's like, I'm speaking for me and those who believe like me. And we're all here voluntarily. There's no code of conduct, bylaws, institutional, whatever. This is us coming together with a commitment to serve and to do so lovingly. So it has its sort of, I wouldn't say pluses and minuses, but it has its moments where you're like, can I say this? Can I actually say this? Is it okay to say it? And then I remember, yes, it is. Now it is. Now it's okay to say this. I've taken the leap of faith. I am in the air and in God's hands. Let whatever happen, Whereas before I was like, no, you can't, because then you're representing this institution and this position and this and this, that. And it's all good. It's all good.
I think that's just amazing because it's almost like you said, we serve, right? And in the organization, you serve under title and position, and you have to live up to this ideal of it. Whereas also when you're engaging with people and in service, you also have to be your authentic self, connecting to the humanity of others. And holding that title and position doesn't let you sometimes to connect to the humanity of others because you are expected to be something. And I'm loving our conversation, and I'm loving what it has brought us to, the understanding of being more of our authentic selves and having more that social connection with individuals that we serve. So I think that's amazing. I mean, like when I understand the context of your journey and how you experienced the different avenues, and each one had its lessons, it's molding you, its experiences, it's making you stronger, and it brought you to a place of where you can just serve in your authenticity, right?
As best as possible, because remember that our authenticity is a lifelong process. We're not born with a certain understanding of our authentic self. It's actually, and I think wisdom demands that we're constantly confronted with, wait a minute, is this how I should be, or is this what I should say, or is this me? We're constantly asking ourselves those questions. And in some traditions, you say, no, is this true? Yeah, you ask yourself those questions, and Pope Francis and other spiritual and leadership coach leaders tell us this, before you say something, is it true? Is this fact that I'm about to say true? Do I really believe it myself? And is it helpful to articulate this? Is it just me showing off how much I know? Or is this actually helpful to this community I'm engaging, this person I am walking alongside? Is it helpful? Because very often, and I think we live in that age right now where we think, authenticity may be just say what you think. There are a few checks and balances to being authentic. We have to ask ourselves the question all the time: is what I'm about to say true? Do I believe it? And is sharing it something that will be helpful, actually? Or is it just to make myself sound great and wise and smart? And I wish so many of our leaders would ask themselves that question too before they say certain things, including women leaders, by the way. It's not just the male leaders that we would always hold this. But I think a lot of us are in the quest for authenticity. Sometimes we actually don't really understand what authenticity is. It isn't being loud. It isn't being so truthful to the point of hurt and hurtful. It isn't a lot of things. And being able to discern even our own selves is only going to be possible in a relational context, no? Because I can sit there with myself the whole day thinking I figured myself out. But it's actually when you engage with others that you begin to more, including your authentic self, whatever that is. But it changes all the time. It's not like it doesn't change from being honest to being a liar, but it changes in terms of how you're coping with your understanding of authenticity and your service. If you are interested in service, in your service authentically, there's constantly checks and balances and questioning that takes place, not to debilitate you, not to weaken you, not to make you less confident, but on the contrary, to make you more, to make your service more palatable, affordable, welcome, because you don't want to alienate the same people you're trying to serve by being so darn smart. You also have to somehow defer. So yeah, it's not a set mold. We're constantly living it out, this authenticity business. Sorry.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for those insights. Because that's one of the reasons why I created this podcast channel. It's meant to have those insights and that meaningful conversations of being more of our authentic self, but also understanding other people's life's journey as well, and relating to it, but also learning from it and getting insights from it as well. And because now I know that you've been involved a lot in the religious space, right? And there's a lot going on in our world right now, in terms of religious wars or conflict. And, I just want to hear your insights a bit on this, because we've had a history of religious wars, and you look at the current world situation. There's so much hate, there's so much anger, there's so much animosity. You get bombarded on social media with so much stuff that's happening. This attacking this, this terrorist, this extremist. People are angry, and people are like wanting to stand up. There's a lot going on, and being us people in the interfaith space, we always learn to stay neutral or step back and observe and reflect before reacting to any of those situations. So, in your perspective of the current situation that's happening right now in the world, do you think that like peace is possible in religion in the context of today's world? And, because it's influenced by a lot of things, even politics, because you've been in the political space as well. And what are your thoughts around this?
Boy, how long have we got, Marilyn? Time-wise, I would say three things. I'll try to keep them as succinct as possible. Point number one, which is, by the way, not my forte. I don't speak succinctly. I tend to speak too long. So please feel free to full stop me. Point number one, what we see happening around us is actually, perhaps ironically, a rapprochement, coming closer together between religious and political institutions and leaders. Okay, that is a phenomenon that we're seeing happen. And this happens throughout human history. There have been fluctuations where the religious and the political are in sync, and then they some other moments in time when they're not necessarily that much in sync, and then they go again to being very much in sync, and so on. I think there's been fluctuations in observing the relationships between religious and political institutions historically. We are at that moment in time where the relationship, the rapprochement, the closeness is particularly nuanced. And it's not just nuanced in one part of the world, but almost everywhere. You see a closeness between certain political parties and certain religious institutions. You never see a closeness between the multi-religious and a political party. In 99.99% of the cases, you see a closeness between one political party and one religious institution or set of institutions or movements or whatever. So the argument, and this is the second point, the argument is that in order for peace to prevail between the diversity of our world's people, we need to make sure that the multi-religious is the operating principle when it comes to religion. It's the multi-religious that is working, the inter-religious, the multi-religious, whatever you wish to call it, that is actually functional and is the norm. Then the normative framework is the multi-religious. So no one religion has precedent, and it shouldn't have nothing to do with minority-majority realities. As long as a society is multi-religious, it doesn't matter what the percentages of the specific religions are, vis-a-vis one, the multi-religious is represented and equally argued for and argued by one another. The multi-religious is what we're missing hugely. There's been decades of interfaith dialogue, okay? It's the oldest form of human engagement known to humankind, interreligious dialogue. We coexist as different religions, different people of faith in any one country since time immemorial. Hello, it's not something new. But interfaith dialogue and meetings galore and calls to action galore isn't the same as a multi-religious coexistence that holds accountable the political. So point number one, we're seeing plenty of rapprochement between certain religions and certain political institutions. Point number two, the multi-religious is at its weakest, actually, because as soon as you have a rapprochement between one religion and one political party, the rest of the religious become dispersed. They don't matter. Right? So we suddenly find competition between the different religions, not a cohesive, we come together as one communities of faith. And the third point that I think we're seeing today is that in And they go together, huh? So as the rapprochement happens between one religion, one political party, the voices of the multi-religious get dispersed and get lost in the mix, because now it's one religion that is predominant or predominating. The voices get lost in the mix. Misogyny and patriarchy settle on a throne, resettle on the throne, because the multi-religious is the quintessential litmus test of social coexistence. How we manage our multi-religious coexistence tells us a lot about how we're managing our diverse coexistence, right? And if that isn't going very well, and there is now a specific religion that is in cahoots with a specific political agenda, invariably you'll hear and see the male-dominated, the patriarchal, and in some cases the outright misogynistic prevail. These trends go together and have done so historically. And that's the moment we're living through right now, where we see that strong coalition between certain religions, certain political parties. We see a bifurcation of the multi-religious, not because their things are not happening. Plenty is happening. I don't think in our human history we've seen so much multi-religious stuff going on, right? A gazillion on one meeting, and tons and tons and tons of things are happening that are multi-religious or interfaith or whatever we wish to call it. It's in fashion, in fact. It's in fashion to be interfaith and multi-religious and da-da-da-da-da-da. It's in fashion. But this is not strong enough, and it is being attacked by the alliance between one religion, one political, in different parts of the world. So the multi-religious is actually being less influential in this space. And with that comes the misogyny. That is the era, the moment we're living in. Does it mean that we cannot live together in peace? Absolutely not. It means that we have to be, first of all, we have to understand that this is part of normal historical evolution, okay, of societies. And many reasons account for it. One of them is that the multi-religious has actually not done a very good job of providing an alternative political and social framework of coexistence. If we were multi-religiously inclined and we found that space is something that can create and does invent and does allow and does flourish, we wouldn't need to go back to our respective religious communities and hide behind them and then want to make alliances with the political so that we are safe and protected. We wouldn't need to. If the multi-religious was flourishing, it would put a stop to the attempt to align one religion with one political party. It would be nonsensical. It would make it not necessary. And at the same time, it would allow for the flourishing of differences of perspectives and attitudes and ways of being, because we are coexisting, we're thriving together. Empires of old that are at their height were included and were built on the diversity of their peoples. We can see that we're not living in that moment right now. We're living in a moment where there's a retrenchment into our respective ideologies. They could be religious, they could be secular, doesn't matter. But there's a retrenchment, there's a withdrawal into your respective space, what you feel comfortable with, religiously, politically, etc. To me, that is a clear sign that the multi-religious has a lot more work to do to provide an alternative political and social scenario, space, and set of realities. And that's what we have to do. That is exactly what we have to do. We have to be part of the multi-religious that is thriving by providing not only mantras, not only good things to say, but by actually serving communities. That's why you remember I created the Multi-Religious Humanitarian Fund when I was there in Religions for Peace, because the idea was we have to serve together multi-religiously. We have to be seen to be serving together, serving real needs in real time, not just talking the good stuff. The good stuff is great. That we talk the good stuff is great. It needs to happen because words also have remarkable influence. But we're at a moment in time when we need to actually be serving the multitudes in need. And to be able to serve together is to be able to honor our respective faith tradition, but also to provide a very real, tangible example of what it is like to live in multi-religious contexts, because we're serving one another. We're not just talking in lovely meetings in lovely cities around the world and spending tons of money on it, but we're actually serving one another at all kinds of levels of community. Multi-religious service is the foundation of successful multi-religious coexistence, which in turn feeds into and informs different ideas of being, different political realities. We have not done very well in the multi-religious service. And COVID taught us the example of how, not that the religious stopped serving, on the contrary, that they ramped up. Every single religious entity ramped up its services significantly because governments were faltering. They couldn't cope with the extent of the need. So the religious actually ramped up their service. They had to fulfill and fill these vacuums. But they didn't do so together. They did so separately. The Catholic community served on its own. Protestants served together. Orthodox served. Muslim Sunnah, Muslim Shia, Hindus. Everyone was ramping up their services, but no one was ramping up together. And that's when you see the weakness of the social cohesion, the ability to provide alternative political realities and ways of thinking and mantras. And that's also when you realize that lone religious sharks do very well, to the detriment of the rest of us.
Wow. I never saw it that way, huh? I mean, I always thought that interfaith was same as multi-religious somehow in my understanding. But also, it's so true that you're saying that there's a lot of multi-religious activities, but it's almost like there's still a gap in it. There's no interconnectedness in it, like what we were talking about earlier. And do you think that one of it is because of lack of leadership, or a lack of servant leadership that's needed to create a multi-religious way of being, so that religion could be more a peaceful thing for society?
I think you'll find that at the level of our leadership of many different institutions, organizations, and communities, remember I said that the third thing is this misogyny and patriarchy resettling quite a bit, which means that we see a particular kind of leadership, a particular kind of mentality that dominates. And I think what you're seeing now is that as long as, and by the way, multi-religious and interfaith have often been understood as being one and the same, Marilyn. I am the one that is insisting on making a distinction, because multi-religious is multi-religious. But interfaith, okay, so here's the different religions. Interfaith is the palm of your hand that brings it all together. That means that you have to have a common thing, not a common religion, but a common understanding. And for me, that common understanding cannot just be something that you talk about. It has to be what you do. Because remember, it's the hand. You serve, you do, you create with the hand. So this palm is the interfaith that brings all together, holds it together in service. In service. Yes? Historically. And if you look at different communities, where you're at right now in South Africa, anywhere in Egypt, in my part of the world, anywhere, if you look at the community level, the more grassroots you get, the more you notice something. The more you notice that those who are serving the most and serving everybody at the same time because they're interested in making sure everyone is okay, and that's part of what they do anyway, are the women. So you see a lot of women busy doing things, right? You and a whole bunch of the young people of Religions for Peace exemplified that not so long ago. I remember you guys were busy. The height of the lockdown, you guys were busy doing a gazillion and one different things in service to one another and to your communities. And you weren't just sitting at home twiddling your thumbs. On the contrary, you were out there. You and all the other women were out there serving because someone's got to keep things together in the communities, right? And I think when you see patriarchy settle, the male notions, forms, and by the way, patriarchy is not just men. Patriarchy is not just men. Patriarchy is an attitude that women themselves can exemplify brilliantly and defend and carry from generation to generation. Yeah. So when you see the patriarchal become the most determinant, what you're also seeing is a lot of that inspired service to the community is being hampered, is not being helped. Because it's really not about what you're doing. So we've got more important things to attend to. All this nice, sweet stuff that you're thinking of is very nice, but we don't have resources for that. We don't have time for that. We don't, whatever. And so two things happen. Either less collective action takes place between the different communities, including religious communities, or you suddenly see that this work drops from sight. That's still having to be ongoing because people have to live. It somehow drops from sight because what is taking the bulk of your attention, media attention, visible attention at the community level, visible attention at the national level, becomes the patriarchal norm. That becomes the most visible, unfortunately. Whereas efforts of service and giving continue, but they are not there. You can't see them. And if you can't see them, you can't learn from them. You can't lift them up. You can't make them the norm because they're happening at levels that are unseen. So that's what I think we're seeing right now, Marilyn. And I think the challenge is in how do we persist in insisting on that that interfaith service that is for all and that is service. Right now, we're going back into more and more meetings, conferences, and more meetings. And all of them are wonderful and terrific, but they're not leading to a different form of service to humanity. They are not. They are remaining at the level of rhetoric. And we desperately need to see those who are working already on the ground, serving everyone. We need to see more of that. So in your podcast, you can visualize some of these efforts because then people can get to see and can get to hear. Because God knows mainstream media will stay focused on the mainstream. It isn't going to allow us to celebrate, to learn from what is happening in everyday lives, but it's not getting that much attention. So yeah, and I think we need to celebrate the efforts that are taking place at the grassroots levels that are multi-religious in nature, that are multi-ethnic, that are of different diversities in nature, that are religious working with the non-religious together, because that's what societies are like. We need to celebrate those. We need to bring those up and learn from them more. And we need to create that alternative awareness of this stuff. It's not that we don't have to create it. There's nothing to create. There is plenty to celebrate and learn from, obviously.
Wow, thank you so much. I truly appreciate your time. I truly appreciate this moment you spent with me engaging in this conversation. I mean, I've learned so much. It's given me so much insights to understand the other aspects that surrounds religion as well. But also it was wonderful to learn about your life's journey as well that made you and brought you to who you are today. And, you know, when I engaged with you in Religions for Peace, I was always admired you because of what you stood for. And one of the things I've always learned from you was the multi-religious and the multi-stakeholder approach to, building peace when it comes to interfaith. So that's why I said, I want to have you on my podcast because you were somebody that was inspirational and also you were there for the youth, and I appreciate that. I mean, you encouraged and supported us in whatever we did as well. So let me end off this podcast by saying, is there any message that you have to inspire the youth out there? Because we are in challenging times, whether it's emotionally, financially, or religiously in this world. And any inspirational message you have for youth out there to inspire them to empower themselves, but be also live their authentic like life purpose as well.
I can think of something that's always been on my mind, and I think you and I spoke about this before in different contexts. But it doesn't just apply to the youth, but I think the youth are definitely the main engine of realizing this, which is being in witness with one another, for one another, and standing in solidarity with one another is not a choice. It is absolutely necessary. I think my generation may not be the best example, actually. I'm being very polite and diplomatic. I believe the youth of today have a responsibility to teach the generations older than them what solidarity is. And that's what we're seeing in so many different parts, in so many universities, in so many different protests around the world. We're seeing solidarity that is youth-driven. And I think that that's what we need to continue to see, that you don't need to wait for us to figure things out, because we obviously are not doing such a terribly good job of it. But you do need to, in a sense, almost teach us about solidarity. And that's not easy, because it means taking responsibility for us. It means it's not a one-way thing. Teaching is not a one-way thing. It's a mutual process. Yes. So to teach solidarity is to engage with one another. And that can be extremely hard. And there's always a price to pay on all sides. But we need the young people to teach solidarity and take responsibility for our presence, the older ones among them. And it's not, yes, of course, as I keep saying this, I owe you everything, but you kind of owe me too, right? There's a mutuality of responsibility. And I need you to be the ones that show what this solidarity is like, which means we'll both end up probably paying a bit of a price for it. But solidarity is what we need more than ever. And I need the younger generation to be able to hold that, to showcase that, while also holding hands with the others and being responsible for the different generations. It's not just that the youth should have a sense of entitlement about what they're owed. We need that sense of common responsibility. And it won't work if only one cohort, youth or elderly, get their rights while the others are struggling. It won't work. We all need to get to our rights together. And that means we need to take responsibility for one another. But given the state of the world, we need the young people to showcase the ways forward.
Thank you so much. So it was lovely to have you. And I wish you all the best on your life's journey.
Thank you for having me, Marilyn. It was lovely to see you, and it's always nice to speak about these things. So I appreciate the opportunity very much. I wish you the very best. When you're ready, please send this to me so that I can also share your podcasts going forward.
I'll do that. And thank you so much. And I also wish you all the best in your journey as well, and in the service that you do. And I'm sure we'll cross paths again.
Inshallah. Inshallah. Take good care. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Bye.